Donald Trump repeatedly vowed to mend the fractured relationship between the United States and Russia. He also promised to lift the sanctions if he was elected.
I use sanctions very powerfully against countries that deserve it, and then I take them off. Because look, you're losing Iran, you're losing Russia.
However, according to a survey conducted by Bloomberg, many Russian billionaires do not believe Trump will follow through on his promise. So just how badly have the sanctions affected Russia's economy? And why is Putin lying to the people about the war in Ukraine? The Russian government recently put forward an ambitious forecast that predicts a gradual economic climb and annual growth rates reaching at least 3% by the end of Putin's fifth term. However, Bloomberg's interview with half a dozen billionaires in Russia shows a clear difference between the government's optimistic outlook and the harsh economic reality. These billionaires doubt the government's rosy projection of Russia's future, and for good reasons. According to the Central Bank of Russia's forecasts, inflation is expected to hover around 4%. It predicted a steady increase in investments, income, and consumer activities. In September 2024, the government published a medium-term forecast, anticipating growth to jump from 2.5% in 2025 to 2.8% by 2027. While this prediction provides a sense of security and progress for Russia, according to Bloomberg, these billionaires believe the forecast is unrealistic. Many of the billionaires interviewed by Bloomberg do not believe that Trump could end the war in Ukraine anytime soon. And even if Trump follows through on this promise, they argue that the sanctions imposed on Russia aren't going to disappear overnight. Russia is under intense sanctions on its industry and finance. And with the complex structure of the US government, Russian billionaires doubt Trump can bring any real change before the economy collapses. Speaking of economies, Bloomberg reports that Russian billionaires are especially worried about the alarming pace of structural changes the economy faces. The war in Ukraine has driven international companies out of Russia, hitting the country's production capacity hard, especially in critical sectors like technology and engineering. The exit has created a gap that domestic companies struggle to fill, leading to a drop in innovation and productivity. And to top it off, the economy's focus towards military production to support the ongoing conflict in Ukraine has diverted crucial resources from civilian industries. This has reduced the import substitution efforts, which Russia has become increasingly dependent on. As the Russian government reassigns skilled labor to meet defense demands, the country now faces a labor shortage. These issues have only intensified as conscription continues to pull workers out of the labor force.
The economy is particularly hard hit by a shortage of personnel due to Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine and Putin's mobilization efforts. Hundreds of thousands of workers have left the country. This immigration has become the largest in the last 3 decades, with highly skilled professionals leaving first. Mobilization and significant losses in the Russian army at the front have led to complaints about a labor shortage across all sectors of the economy, except perhaps in the defense industry. Analysts predict a decline in production in the private sector if this trend continues.
With no workers left, many companies and businesses have had to downscale their operations. And as Russia channels its resources into military production and replaces imports with lower quality domestic alternatives, its long-term industrial competitiveness is on the line. However, despite the challenges, some still believe that Russia has enough resources to support its economy through the war. But this comes at a price. The government is forced to continuously prioritize resource allocation to sustain its wartime economy. Put simply, a larger percentage will be allocated to the military complex, rather than building infrastructures to ease its citizens' burdens.
Russia is preparing for a long war. Evidence of this is a draft budget for the next 3 years. In 2025, the Kremlin plans to spend 13.5 trillion rubles on the army and military-industrial complex. Another 3.5 trillion rubles will go to security forces. Together, these two areas account for about 40% of total budget expenditures. This trend is expected to continue in 2026 and 2027.
While Russia is focused on pumping billions into their military, inflation and interest rates are at an all-high. And the recent spike is the most shocking any Russian has ever seen. A major problem for Russian businesses right now is the central bank's record-high key rate of 21%.
Inflation is steadily eroding their modest incomes. In October, the central bank raised the key interest rate again, which now stands at 21%. This has happened before, experts note, recalling when Russia tried to overcome the crisis of the 90s.
This has made borrowing nearly impossible for companies already struggling under sanctions and production issues. Some billionaires interviewed recognize that central bank head Elvira Nabiullina has few options left to cool the economy and control inflation, given the massive government spending on the war. The central bank later said in a statement that growth in domestic demand is still significantly outstripping the capabilities to expand the supply of goods and services.
Предприятия все чаще сталкивались с проблемами по наращиванию выпуска товаров и услуг из-за ограниченности трудовых ресурсов и высокой загрузки мощностей.
Coupled with the fact that Russia's major source of revenue, their export of oil and gas, has been heavily affected by the airtight sanctions imposed by the West, forcing Russia to look for alternatives. Western government imposed a $60 price cap on Russian oil to prevent prices going above this limit. Although Russia managed to dodge this cap by using its own fleet of tankers without relying on Western insurance, earning up to $17 billion in oil revenue in July alone. Most of this money has been funneled directly into the war effort in Ukraine. One of the most eye-opening insights from Bloomberg's sources touches on how the Russian government talks about the war and its effect on inflation. A billionaire told Bloomberg that high inflation might be easier to justify if the government openly admitted Russia is in a full-scale war, instead of calling it a special military operation.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима.
The Russian government's push to maintain an illusion of normalcy has created a disconnect with the public. The denial of the war's full scope has created an environment where Russian citizens see the high inflation as a normal phase in the economy, rather than a consequence of wartime spending. Trump's administration might help reduce the sanctions placed on Russia. However, the country's economy is already crumbling due to the war in Ukraine. So check out this deep dive, where I'll show you why Russia's economy is done.